Have you ever watched a movie scene that feels rich and immersive, where every element pops with dimension? That's the magic of lighting for depth, and what separates a flat shot from one that feels alive and full of story. When I first started, my shots often felt one-dimensional. I'd light my subject, and everything behind them faded into nothingness. But then I discovered how layering light can make your frame come to life, and the difference in my work was night and day. In this video, I'm gonna break down how to use lighting to create depth in your shots. We'll go over techniques to highlight the foreground, add interest to your midground, and create a background that complements your scene without overpowering it. We'll talk about light placement, using shadows to create contrast, and tricks like backlighting and edge lighting to separate your subject and add that cinematic feel that we're all looking for. And make sure you stick around to the end because I'm saving one of my favorite tricks for last, a layering technique that transforms even the smallest and simplest setups into captivating shots. If you're ready to make your shots look more professional and engaging, let's dive into the art of lighting for depth. This is one of the most important topics when it comes to cinematography and creating an image that has interest. When we go back to the basics and fundamentals of anything when it comes to saying what makes an image good, it is interest and contrast, the light and dark parts of our image. There's a more advanced technique when we talk about lighting different parts of your image to give you that interest and contrast. And we're gonna break those down in each of these examples. So my one is just gonna be my foreground. My two is going to be my midground, which is generally where your viewer's attention is going to be. It really depends on what you're shooting, but that's just generally a rule of thumb. And three is my background. And so when we look at this image here, uses ever so slightly, but there is a plant on this side, and this is going to be my foreground. And then when we look at everything else and what we're actually in focus, this entire thing, you can kind of argue, is going to be my midground here. And then when we look at the background, we have a little kitchen that we're dealing with and some lights that you can see in the background there. And that's what we're going into this entire thing. Before we even do that, we have to understand what we are shooting. And this is the framework and system that we like to preach. And we are shooting a nighttime dinner scene. There is no natural daylight coming in here, and we are going to emulate what that natural dinner scene is going to look like. So you can start at your foreground, you can start at your midground, or you can start at your background. There's no really rules to do this. And a lot of my examples that I've talked about before in other videos that I've liked to do my background or my room first. But in this one, it was kind of different because we are dealing with the context of what the entire scene is. And I'm going to start with my midground, which is the dinner scene. And when we talk about this framework of what makes an image interesting or cinematic, it all comes down to lighting, especially when you're looking at these layers. And if you want to learn this exact framework on how we light our commercials and this step-by-step process, we are releasing a course at the end of the month called Cinematic Lighting Lab. Check out the link in the description below to find out more. When we talk about dinner scenes or anything that involves a house environment, we are talking about light that is coming from the top. Generally, anything that has to deal with the house, everything is coming from the top unless you have something motivated by it, like a window, or it's obviously daytime, or you have a situation like that. But generally at nighttime, it's going to be top lit. So we have our camera here, and then we have that little plant that you see over there. And then obviously this is not to scale. We have our dinner table here with our main talent and our supporting talents all around at different places. So there's 4 of them in general. And then we have a little kitchenette with an island back here, and that is going to be our background. So let's label this 1, 2, and 3 so we just can understand what we're actually looking at. To light our midground here, which is where our subject is, we use a light panel. So that was boomed overhead directly on top of the table. So if I were to draw like a side view of this is the table, and this is where my main subject is, and my camera is back here. We have a light mat, and that has the diffusion on it, as well as the grid, so we can control the spill. So the light is not going everywhere, but it's directed down this way. That's the main thing that you want to do with these dinner time scenes. And that is giving my light all on my subject here, all over the table, and then highlighting the high parts or the parts that are sticking out when we talk about our talents and also just objects in general. So when you do top lighting, it's going to highlight everything that is basically on top. That's what top lighting does. So that is exactly our light source, but I was noticing that this was a little bit too directional. It felt like a little bit too spotlighting, and there wasn't enough room. Because yes, all this light is coming off and then bouncing across all the other parts of the room and kind of reflecting and giving more and more ambience, but I needed more ambient tone. And the way that we did that is I like to bias my ambient tone so I can develop some more shadow and contrast. So that is a sky panel that is just pointed up to the ceiling. And to give you guys a reference of where these lights are kind of falling, we have that light mat right here. Again, we have that grid on that, so we're controlling our spill. And then I'm going to add something that adds basically all that ambient and spill back into it. So we have our light mat, and this is set to 40%. This is a very old light, and this is set to 2700 Kelvin. So everything was on dials. It's not like aperture or Amaran fixtures, which are very easy to dial in. So I just had my gaffer on that. And then we had a sky panel here set to 20%, and this is at 2700 Kelvin as well. And that is giving my ambient tone. And then you can see some of that ambient tone even on our actor's face there, and kind of giving us a backlight on his back. I didn't want it to be completely directional and be very like moody, and we're dealing with this dinner time scene that is very like dramatic. This is a broadcast commercial that was done for the Raptors. So this is going to be feeling a little bit more lifted, a little bit more interesting. And now when we talk about the foreground here, we just have some of that light spilling here and giving us a nice highlight. And then we go into the fundamentals of salt and pepper and checkerboard. We have this light, and then we have a little dark green there to give us some more interest. If this was just all one color where it's just light blasted at it, it would be really interesting. It'd be a little bit weird. And the main thing that really separates a lot of people is lighting your background. And the secret is using tiny little fixtures. So I have a kit of MCs that I carry with me all the time. I live and die by these things. And you can actually see the edge of the LCD panel. But I have two MCs right here shooting light down into this. So if you were to look at the stove, there's an MC there, an MC there. And then I tried them in a different bunch of places, and it was just me with the director's monitor holding that while somebody was on camera. And then I put them into the glass cabinets, bounce it off the wall, see what really looked natural. And before you even do that, a big tip is to turn on the lights that naturally are there. So there was a stove there, so I just turned on the vent hood lights, and then they were just shining right down and giving me this natural vibe. And the director's like, I like that. That looks good, but it's a little bit too bright. Can we recreate that with the lights that we have? And then I just put the little two MCs up there, and this is giving me that natural splash of light in the background. And this just gives me, when we look at this from a point of light and dark parts, we have some shadow here, shadow a little bit on her arm, a shadow under the table, and him here, a little bit in the background, and then basically in a bunch of different places. And then we have these nice little highlights in a bunch of different places. So if you really want to analyze the past work that you've done, or even look at your image now and think about these, in this case, yellow and blue lines as light and shadow, this will give you a bit more really context in saying like, do I have enough interest here? And sometimes you can really overdo this and have too much. So it's little subtle things. Usually I have like two MCs in the background. I don't have a full kit of 4. That is a little bit too much, and it might be necessary for something that's very high key and lifted. But for this, it was absolutely perfect. And this is the perfect example of using a lot of small little light fixtures in this, and it works. It's not too distracting, it's not too glaring. We are dealing with a pottery studio here, and we use a bunch of different small little lights. And when you talk about this, like, Zachary, this might be a little bit too much for me, but this is just a concept to show you when you have an extreme wide shot like this and adding interest back in your frame. If you don't have a lot of these lights, you can just go in and only use this side of the room. We were shooting extreme light, and we wanted light all over the place, so this is exactly what we did. And before we even did that, we walked into her space and we like, hey, do you have any display lights that you have? And we just turned them on, and then she has a little LED strips everywhere, and then we're like, perfect. And she's like, I like this because it showcases my work and everything off naturally, and I like to work in the studio like this, especially when it's dark and I don't have the garage door open. So we're like, great. How can we emulate that a little bit more with the lights that we're using? We're not necessarily going to have strips of light going everywhere, but we want these little dabbles and little pockets of light there, as well as some interest all over the place. So with these light fixtures, we had the opportunity to put some bulbs in there, so that just allowed us to control the levels. But let's go into looking at what we have in the mid, background, and foreground. And this is a little bit weird to really establish what the foreground is, but I'm going to establish it as this pipe over here, because the camera is like kind of crawling along the ceiling, and this can be considered my foreground as well. And then my midground is whatever's in the middle of the room, what we're focusing on, and then the background is over here, actually outside the room. If we were to draw this as a top down and kind of have like this separated so we don't get confused of what's being drawn here, this is my background as in my outside, my midground over here, and then my foreground is not necessarily something that is right in front of camera, But in this, where we have some interest and we're looking at reflections as well as light and dark parts of our image. Let's start at the midground because we, again, talked about her space and what she has. And that's exactly where we started. So we put 4 B7C bulbs, and then we also have a bunch of MCs. So we had 1, 2, 3, and then there's 4. So if we were to draw those like that, 2 and 3 and 4. And then we had a little aperture tube light in her display case here. And I don't exactly know. I think it's an MT Pro or something like that. My gaffer had it, and it was a lifesaver just to add a little bit more detail right here. And then we had these all on the Sidus Link app. And then basically when she came in and walked through this door here, she turned on the light switch, and then my gaffer turned everything on, and then she walks in and completes the action. So it's these little highlights that are just around the room that showcase her space nicely and what we're talking about, which is highlighting her products. And she is in a pottery studio, and we thought it was just a little bit bland not to have any of these little small highlights. Again, you could get like a 16 kit here, but I feel like that would be a little bit too overkill because we have a lot of interest. And a lot of that interest actually came in the background with painting this light that we see on this back wall. And I did that with a simple tube light, and that was a Nanlite Pavo tube because we like to use these in a pinch. And I just had this on a C-stand with a Cardellini clamp, and this is set to 5600 Kelvin, and all these are set to 2700 Kelvin to give you that warmth on the inside as well. And this was sitting at 10%. I don't remember the lights, what these were at, but these were probably sitting at 1 to 5%, just because they're so low and we're using a camera that had a high enough ISO that you could see all this information. And then we have so many lights turning on the space, so we didn't need a lot of power, and practicals are very kind of sometimes hard to light because it gets a little bit too sourcey. But that tube light is just simply on a stand, and it's painting this wall and giving me that nice color contrast as well as depth in my image. And it gives me a nice little flare as well in the window. And then when we even talk about this light source too, this is just the natural sunlight, and this is blue due to setting our camera's white balance to 4400 Kelvin. And this is another topic of color contrast and everything, but when we talk about lighting and really what's lighting the space, I like to separate it and really think about that aspect so we can add even more interest. And when I added that light to the background, it was giving me a nice highlight in the garage door and like this kind of like bluish tinge here. So that was lighting the background and giving me a lot of information here. But it also added to my midground here. So it's just like you can have lights in your background that light multiple things at once. And this is like more of an advanced example. And then when you even go to our foreground, it's just like all these reflections and what we're crawling across with this smooth dolly in. And this reflection here is giving me more interest and more of that salt and pepper as well as checkerboard of light and dark parts when we talk about interest and what gives an image that cinematic look. The last example that we're going to be looking at here is going to be a 2-shot, because in the second shot, I actually used kind of a secret weapon that I love to use when I'm developing interest in depth. And I already kind of talked about it a little bit, but I'm going to dive it a little bit more in this example. This is another, not dinner scene, but this is kind of like a round table in a moody environment with all these kids talking about their experiences in the curling community. This is what the commercial was for. And let's talk about our mid, back, and foreground. So our foreground here, in this case, is this big table that's right in front of us, and it's ever so slightly. Our midground is where our subjects are, and then our background here is this trophy case. So you can already see what the play is. We have a bunch of MCs, so one there, one little up here. And then we had a combination of like small like Nanlite tube lights, and then we pointed them actually up in this direction because these were like glass panels. So it would kind of light the full case and not necessarily one aspect of this. So we just wanted to highlight small things and really give this less nice dark and light parts of this trophy case without being overpowering. And then it gives us a nice little slash of light on this side of the wall, as well on the ceiling, which is really nice as well. So it gives you that already interest in the background. But automatically my eyes are driven to the center of the image where these kids are. And the way we did that is we used a set of 2 Titan tubes, which were above this, and then we had a set of grids on them. So if you imagine that we had some material there and the material on the side, and all this light is coming down. And I like to use Titan tubes for a lot of this work, but generally I like to use like a light mat or something that I can diffuse even more, or put an artificial silk in front of it, because I find that the Titan tubes are inherently a little bit too harsh. But just due to the distance that we were dealing with here, because it's so long, this gave us enough that we were already looking for. But unfortunately, we had to run these at 100% power just because of the distance that they were away. And these were set at a 2700 Kelvin as well. And then because these lights are so far away, they were giving us a bunch of spill all over the place, which you can see this highlight on this pillar here, this highlight ever so slightly on this pillar, and then the reflection off this table, which is ever so slight, but it gives us a lot of interest. And really what we're looking for when we're trying to light our foreground, midground, and background. This is just a classic top light setup where it's not too harsh and it's giving us nice highlights on our subject. And when we're dealing with these type of skin tones, I love to use 2700 Kelvin because just it highlights it the best. But you can see when they're going into leaning in for actions, you get a little bit of the raccoon eyes and it's not as pleasing, and it's only highlighting like the cheekbones, the top of the forehead, as you can see right there. So it is nice, and it's popping him and separating him from the background as well as here. And that is a classic rim light. And then you can see with that spill coming across there. But really plays in this and fills the shadows. I would say she's in the most natural position because she's not necessarily leaned in over like this kid. And this is due to just the bounce from the natural table that's coming here. And bounce light is your best friend when it comes to any of these projects. And you're going to see in the next example when we go into the coverage of how we utilize that even more. So obviously when I jump back and forth between these images, this is a little bit more curated. This is a little bit more lit because we're dealing with lighting direction and everything here. But that is commercials. This is not necessarily a continuity error. We're prioritizing the cinematography rather than being true to what this would look like. If I punched in and I was shooting this subject here, it wouldn't be as flattering and it wouldn't really look as good, and it would be something that we were really proud of. So this was just kind of a decision, and we really light our wide and then move in and use modifiers to light the tight shots or this cross coverage that we're dealing with here. Let's go into the basics and analyzing what our mid, foreground, and background is here. And it's ever so subtle, but this is the face of the gentleman that is to the left of our subject here. So if we go back to our first shot, that is this subject over here. We had to cheat him obviously a little bit in, and we were shooting this on a longer lens. Could you get that effect? Because in actuality, their distance when they were talking in the wider shot was a lot more. And then our midground is obviously going to be our subject, and our background is going to be whatever this is, which is just a subtle staircase. And this is my biggest secret weapon when I try to create depth when it comes to lighting certain things. I only necessarily have one light source to deal with, or I have a limited amount of lights. I analyze where the natural light is coming from and how I can control that. Let's draw a top down here so we can analyze this even further. And this is the round table, and this is the main gentleman that we're shooting right here. And then my camera is positioned right here. So we have, again, the top light that we established, and all that light is coming from there. But then there's like a wall here and then a stairwell that goes down here. And this is actually a doorway, which is all glass. So this is a bunch of the natural sunlight coming in. But you're like, oh, this looks like a nighttime scene. So what we actually did is we covered this in this cheap, not duvetine, but black material that we got off of Amazon. It is a 10 by 20. And we got it for 20 bucks. And when we covered it, we're like, that's a little bit too much because all this is just nothingness. And we didn't realize what we were doing at the time, but we were lighting for layers in our image. We were lighting for our mid, foreground, and background without even knowing that. We're like, there's not a lot going on here in separating our subjects. Even when we look at like the checkerboard of light, dark, light, and then dark, and then light again on his face. So what we did is we just kind of half that off and then prioritize it on one side. And then we had all that light coming in and then bouncing off this wall and then giving us some color onto this. But you're gonna be like, Zachary, that's not daylight. My kind of biggest secret weapon is using daylight and changing the color using my camera's white balance. So my camera is set at 4000 Kelvin, and this pushes 5600 Kelvin to something that is more blue. And when we go into color contrast, that's a whole entire thing, but I like to push the orange and teal look, but not orange and teal completely because I feel like that's just a little too much. I like to push the orange and blue look, really that cyan, deep, rich blues, and then those ever so slightly subtle oranges. That's what I love to do. And I feel like this is the first piece that we actually did that. And then when we talk about our key light and our subject and lighting the midground, because we already talked about the background, because this was acting as our midground and foreground. So we have those Titan tubes above that are crated off so we don't have a bunch of spill on the wall. We just want to be lighting our subject. we have those coming down, and our subject is here, and then my camera is pointed over here with our other subject in the background, but we're going to be focusing on him. And we're like, this is a little bit too much. This is a little bit too horror movie. Like, we're sitting around a campfire, and this is supposed to be a natural commercial where they're laughing, and this is supposed to be lighthearted. So we had a bunch of bounce light coming off here, but it wasn't enough. And we were like, we need something to lift that more up. And it's not adding another light so we can establish a key side and have a shadow side, but it was actually adding a bounce in right here. And at that time, we were basically starting in our filmmaking career. We didn't have access to like foam core or like have the foresight to bring in Bristol board. So we use is a piece of cardboard that we just cut up, and then we use that. And that is giving me a natural, nice catch light there and bouncing all that light back up into my subject. And then we just biased it on a little bit of an angle. If we draw a top down over table, and then our actor is sitting here, camera is over here, I biased it on this side with my gaffer holding that, so that light would come up and bounce. So I would still have some shadow on this side here. When we talk about what makes an image interesting and the basics and fundamentals is shooting into the shadow side of our subject. And what I mean by that is this shadow here. So when we talk about the shape and what makes this interesting and what makes our foreground interesting is that we have that highlights coming in from the top that kicks him out from the background from that top light. And that smoothly transitions down into the highlights and high spots of his face, which are his cheekbones as well as his nose. But then what that bounce is doing is it's filling up everything else and giving me that in a soft, cinematic, basically looking light. When we talk about light, it's not just having one source hitting our subject, it's having multiple sources with multiple different levels. In this case, we have the highlights of the top light, and then we have that bounce source, which is going to be at a lower level as well as softer, giving us a different quality of light. So I don't want you guys to think about lighting your foreground and midground with all different types of lights, but also think about different types of exposures, different quality of lights, and different levels. And it will really help you really develop looks and really drive your attention of what you want your viewer to feel, as well as just creating images that you're happy with.